This presentation will cover the second half of Unit 2, specifically the different families of instruments. These include strings, woodwinds, brass, percussion, keyboard instruments, including organ and synthesizer. When we think of an orchestra, many times the first instruments that come to mind are the strings. Strings are chordophones. They produce their sounds by stretching strings between 2 points, then vibrating that string by strumming, plucking, or pulling a bow across it. A bow is a curved piece of wood with synthetic or real horsehairs stretched across it. The string player pulls the hair of the bow over the string to create the sound. There are many different kinds of string instruments that date back thousands of years. Yet there are 4 standard orchestral string instruments from highest pitch to low. They are violin, viola, cello, and the double bass. You will also find the harp in an orchestra, though it is less common than the other instruments. Another very common and popular string instrument is the guitar. It can be acoustic or electric and is used in from pop to classical to international music. The book has several musical examples of the string instruments. Listen to these examples and see how different and similar string instruments can be. Woodwinds are made of wood or metal and have holes or openings that the player covers and uncovers with his or her fingers to change the pitch. Generally speaking, the more holes that are covered, the lower the pitch will be. Most of the woodwind instruments produce sounds using a reed, a small, shaped piece of wood. The only exception is the flute, which is a metal instrument where the sound is created by blowing over a hole. The text gets into more technical detail about the woodwind family, so read through the material carefully. The orchestral woodwind instruments are the flute. As I mentioned before, the flute is the only metal woodwind instrument and the only one that does not use a reed. It produces a light, sweet sound and can play into a very high range of notes. The oboe uses what is known as double reed, which is 2 small pieces of wood bound together and attached to a piece of cork that is put into the instrument. The oboe sound is lovely, with a more nasal timbre than the flute. A slightly larger and lower pitched version of the oboe is the English horn. The clarinet is next. This uses a single reed. The clarinet produces a dark, rich sound, and several kinds of clarinets are used in the orchestra and wind band. The clarinet that usually comes to mind is the soprano clarinet, but the alto and bass clarinet are also quite common. The bassoon is the last woodwind we will discuss. Like the oboe, it uses a double reed and produces a similarly nasal sound, but it is markedly bigger than the oboe. The bassoon, along with the bass clarinet, is the bass voice of the woodwind family. Another woodwind instrument is the saxophone. It is a single reed instrument that comes in a variety of sizes. Soprano, alto, tenor, and baritone are the most commonly used in classical, jazz, and pop music. The other family of wind instruments is the brass. The brass are indeed made out of brass and generally produce a brighter and more powerful sound than the woodwinds. The sound is made by buzzing the lips into a mouthpiece that in turn vibrates the instrument body. In all except one instance, the pitch is altered by pressing valves. These valves lengthen the instrument, which makes the pitch lower. Adjusting the lips or embouchure also changes the pitch level. The 4 common orchestral brass instruments from high to low pitch are the trumpet, the horn, also known as French horn, the trombone, and the tuba. The trumpet, horn, and tuba all have valves. The trombone, on the other hand, uses a slide to change pitch. By extending the slide, the pitch lowers. When you bring the slide in, the pitch raises. More detailed descriptions of the brass instruments, along with audio examples, are in the text. Acquaint yourself with the various wind instruments, so you are able to identify them in the listening examples. It will enrich the musical experience. Percussion are some of the oldest instruments we know of. The way most percussion instruments produce sound is simple. Two items are struck together, or the instrument is made to vibrate. There's an interesting description of world percussion at the start of this section of the text. Percussion fall into three broad categories: idiophones, membranophones, and mallets. Idiophones are what I like to call self-contained percussion. They produce sound through the vibration of their own body. Maracas are a good example, as are crash cymbals, or cymbals that are clashed against one another. Membranophones are instruments that have a membrane or skin stretched over them that is struck with a stick or mallet, or your hand. Typical membranophones are the snare drum, bass drum, and timpani, or kettle drums. Many of the instruments I have mentioned do not produce a specific pitch. The one exception is the timpani. That is part of a group of instruments known as pitched percussion. Typically, the pitched percussion are referring to what we call the mallet instruments. Mallet instruments are often made of wood or metal and are usually struck with a yarn or plastic mallet. They include the vibraphone, the xylophone, and the marimba. Electronic percussion instruments have proliferated over the past 30 years in the form of electronic drum sets and beatboxes. These are typically not used in orchestral setting, but they play an important role in popular music. There are hundreds of percussion instruments, and more are invented all the time, so feel free to explore the boundless world of percussion instruments on your own and through the text. Keyboard instruments can be found in the orchestra, but they are more often solo instruments. Because keyboard players can continuously produce multiple notes, one person can play all of the parts it would take an orchestra of strings, woodwinds, and brass players to perform. Keyboard instruments generate sound when the player presses down on the keys. However, they do not fall into one category of instrument because they produce sound in different ways. The piano is a percussion instrument because the felt hammers strike strings inside the body of the instrument to produce sound. It is an extraordinarily versatile instrument that is used in many different musical genres. Most people have heard the piano or played it. The harpsichord plucks strings, so it is a chordophone. This was used in the 1600s and 1700s and has a unique timbre. The pipe organ is an aerophone because it uses columns of air flowing through pitched pipes to create the sound. Because organ is played with both the hands and the feet, and because it uses many different sounds known as stops, it is one of the most versatile of all instruments. It has earned its nickname, the King of Instruments. The synthesizer is an electrophone because its sound is produced electronically. This gives it a distinct advantage over other keyboard instruments. A well-programmed synthesizer can be made to sound like almost any other instrument. The sounds do not always replicate the warmth and nuance of its acoustic equivalent, but technology is rapidly improving in that area. The text goes into great detail about the construction and sound mechanisms of the keyboard instruments, so read it thoroughly and listen to the musical examples. Knowing the instruments will deepen your understanding and appreciation of the music you listen to now and for a lifetime.